Hello and welcome back to The Common Good. What is the common good? In a pandemic, why do we expect or why do we want people to understand that there is a common good? Well, it should be obvious, but to a lot of people, it's not very obvious. I mean, for example, you've got somebody like Mike Pence, our vice president, who goes to the Mayo Clinic and everybody around him has masks, but he doesn't have a mask. And when he's asked why he doesn't have a mask, he says, well, I don't really need a mask because, after all, I'm tested for the coronavirus all the time. Even though the clinic had asked people before they visited the clinic to wear a mask, and even though by not wearing a mask, he is sort of modeling for everybody else who's watching out there that top public officials don't care about wearing masks, don't want to wear masks. You see, the common good requires, I would assume, public officials, top public officials, to understand that what they do is going to have an effect on everybody else, and that not only are they role models, but also they cannot demonstrate the kind of entitlement, the notion that they are above the law, above the rules. And when Mike Pence did what he did, it may not seem like a huge deal, but it has a corrosive effect on the common good. The other thing that I was kind of struck by in the last couple of days, and we're going to be talking about, is the Federal Reserve Board advancing that it's going to provide $500 billion of additional money to big corporations in terms of bailing them out, taking on their debt, giving them ultra-low interest loans, but not putting any requirements on them at all, no conditions. In other words, they can use this money for executive pay, to reward their shareholders, to buy back their shares of stock. They can do anything they want with the company, with this money. Well, if there is a common good, hello, you expect that if the Fed, as part of our government, is going to be committing dollars, and even though the Fed can basically print its own money, nevertheless, there are some public obligations that come with that power. Abuse of power is very close to a failure to understand that there is any obligation that comes with power. And then we have somebody else who I really find very fascinating, and I've been watching during this pandemic the whole time. He's somebody in the private sector. Maybe you can guess his name. He's somebody who actually is an entrepreneur. He's widely admired by certain other entrepreneurs. He wants to go to Mars. He thinks he can do that. He invented a new kind of automobile. Well, you're right. His name is Elon Musk. And what he said yesterday is that everybody ought to get back to work. This whole business of sheltering in place is an attack on people's freedom. He said that. He said he called the quarantine fascist. And he said that officials have to give people their freedom back, their freedom to work. Well, what Elon Musk seems not to know, or if he does know, he seems not to be willing to express, is that freedom and power are very closely aligned. If you are a worker and you don't have any power and you don't have any money because the federal government hasn't come through with any money to help you, and you would like to shelter in place, you'd like to protect yourself and your family, well, there is no such thing as freedom to work under those circumstances. That is not fascism. If the government advises that people stay home, and the government tells Elon Musk that he cannot run his factory because it is unsafe during a pandemic. I mean, what we've got right now is business leaders all over America demanding that America open up again. They want their shares in their bank accounts, in their stock market to go back to what they were before. They want to make a lot of money. But how about the people who don't have power? How about the people who are not getting the protection they need? How about the workers who are going to be sacrificing or at least risking their lives because a lot of business executives like Elon Musk decide that, well, it must be a matter of freedom. Where's the common good in all of this? Well, if I sound a little bit annoyed, I am. We have to reassert the common good at a time like this. If there's no understanding of the common good when we have a pandemic, when is there going to be an understanding of the common good? Several of you write in, you say, well, what can I do? What can I do? I'm just one person. Well, what you can do is this. In 6 months from now, we're going to have a major election in this country, not only for president, but also for the Senate, for the House, for local and state officials. What you can do right now, 6 months before, is to start getting ready. Even though you are sheltering at home, or even though you are busier than ever, even though you have less time, even though you are maybe, some of you, bored out of your gourd, or maybe you are frightened and anxious and insecure, nevertheless, what you can do is start mobilizing and organizing remotely. You can get ready for an election that will be, I know it's been said before, but this certainly is going to be the most important election in your lifetime. And everything that I have said so far today, and everything I've said before about the common good, lack of common good, abuse of power, really comes down ultimately to that election on November 3rd. I want to bring in Katie Milne. Katie, you have been thinking about all of this, and you also understand that we have in this country not only a lack of common good, we've got socialism for the rich, and we've got harsh capitalism, one of the harshest forms of capitalism anywhere, for everybody else. So, Katie, what are we going to do about it?
Well, yeah, I think it's really fascinating. Something that's funny about Elon Musk, a little fun fact, is that he has you blocked on Twitter, which I found pretty funny. And also, I think it's really easy for a billionaire like him to call shelter in place orders fascist when he doesn't have to go back to work. He can just shelter in place in one of his 7 multi-million-dollar mansions. So this really is,
He has seven.
it
He
really,
has seven,
yeah,
seven
seven,
mansions. Seven
seven,
mansions. Well,
seven
he can. So
mansions.
he can.
So
He can shelter in 7 places.
exactly. And I think it really is. We've seen this almost deluge of socialism for the rich, harsh capitalism for the rest. I mean, we've seen, as you discussed, corporations just got another $500 billion blank check from the Fed with even less protections than the first one, which had no protection, pretty much no protections at all. And they just got another one. Meanwhile, for everyday Americans, I mean, we've got the latest data came out today, and 30 million Americans have filed for unemployment. And still, because unemployment benefits are so backlogged, a lot of people, that's not even the full number. So we've got unemployment benefits are backlogged and people can't access their benefits to get through this crisis. You've got small businesses shut out of the Paycheck Protection Program and large chains scooping up millions of dollars. And then you've got the CARES Act that's full of tax breaks for the 1% and the wealthy. And it really is this kind of system of socialism for the rich, harsh capitalism for the rest. So do you want to kind of explain that phrase a little more before we dive in to some of the other examples we've seen in this pandemic?
Well, the phrase itself doesn't need all that much explaining. People can understand. But the reality is that you've got CEOs, Elon Musk and everybody else. They are actually not only doing well, they're doing extremely well. I mean, during this pandemic, Jeff Bezos himself increased his fortune by $26 billion. Elon Musk is doing fine. I mean, there's a lot of belly aching from the billionaire class. But the fact of the matter is that they are backed up. They have socialism in the sense that they don't have to worry about failure. The Fed is backing them up. The Treasury is backing them up. Everybody on Wall Street, they've already been backed up. Wall Street banks are too big to fail. That's all socialism, folks. That's a cartoon version of socialism. But when it comes to actually getting the kind of money you need, the kind of health care you need, paid sick leave, paid family leave, income support, unemployment insurance, anything that anybody else in any other advanced country takes for granted, we don't have in this country. American workers are treated to the harshest form of capitalism that exists. And Katie, we were talking about that $500 billion, that big
Yeah.
bailout that's coming up from the Fed. I mean, what really does bug me about that most of all is that these are the same companies that have been going deeper and deeper into debt before the pandemic to buy
Yep.
back their shares of stock, right? I mean,
Yep.
so you
Exactly.
artificially you create artificially the kind of impression that the stock market is better than it actually is. Donald Trump points to the stock market before the pandemic and said, "Look what I have created." when in fact it is not anything that he has created. It's not anything that any
Yep.
CEO has created, except a stock market that was rising on the basis of rising levels of debt. So now the Fed turns around and it bails out these companies and says, "Don't worry about your debt. Don't worry about it. We're gonna bail you out." Someday, I hope credit rating agencies take the kind of hit that they should be taking. You know, after the 2008 financial crisis, credit rating agencies did not do their job. They did not alert the public, investors, anybody else, at how fragile the banks were. We have the same thing happening right now. The credit rating agencies did not alert anybody about how fragile American corporations were by taking on all the debt they did before the pandemic. And now, what happens? That fragility turns out to be what? An object of the Fed bailing out the biggest banks.
Yeah. So is that what? So I'm a little bit confused as to what like the point is of this second $500 billion bailout. Didn't corporations get enough? So what's the difference between the Treasury giving them these funds and the Fed giving these funds? And what's the point of the second huge $500 billion blank check for corporations? What's the point?
Well, the point is not that different. The Treasury bailout, the direct bailout that went to airlines and Boeing, that was to basically help these companies maintain themselves, and there were conditions attached to them. That is, that bailout,
Minor
those
ones,
bailouts,
yeah.
those bailouts would actually be to some extent forgiven if the companies kept their payrolls going. But these new loans, and they are loans, these are also bailouts because, you see, if these companies, and I'm talking about companies across America, big companies, if they were not in such difficult shape, they could simply go to the bond market, they could sell their bonds, they could basically they could raise money, right? At very low interest rates, because right now it's very hard to for anybody who wants to lend money to make any money at all. So these big companies could, at least if the market were functioning as the market would normally function, these companies could rely on the free market to further go into debt if they wanted to. The fact that the Fed has to do what it's doing suggests that these companies are in worse shape than they actually are, and also suggests that this is much more of a bailout than it is a loan. In other words, the Fed has decided that American companies are really in trouble, big time. This should be a concern to us all, but not because the companies are in trouble, but because the entire economy is in trouble. If you look at the economy, I'm going to say one more thing about this, Katie, and then I'm going to stop talking, because this is really important and it gets me sort of charged up.
Okay.
The economy
I'm ready.
is not, okay, some people think the economy is just a bunch of big companies, or the stock market and these big companies. That's one way of looking at the economy. Another way of looking at the economy that is much more accurate is that the economy is actually working people. 2/3 of all the economy is consumer expenditures, and nobody can spend money if they don't have money. And so the people who are working people, particularly people who spend most of what they earn, those people are the economy. We work for a lot of people work simply because they need the money. 78% of Americans, it's been estimated, work from paycheck to paycheck. And so this economy really is about people. It is people. It is not companies. And if the Fed and other Treasury officials and others believe that they can help people by simply bailing out big companies, they're buying into trickle-down economics, which is a hoax. We've seen it again and again. You don't help people by helping big companies. You help people by helping them directly, by having safety nets that are strong enough, by having unemployment insurance, by having medical care for everybody, by having paid sick leave, and all those other things that we've talked about. Okay, I'm going to stop preaching.
Well, no, you're totally right, and you're not preaching. And I think one of the most egregious examples we've seen about this concept of socialism for the rich and harsh capitalism for the rest has been with the Paycheck Protection Program, which was designed to help small businesses and help those workers at those small businesses directly. But as we've seen during this pandemic, corporations and big companies still manage to find a way to get to the front of the line. I mean, you have all these reports of America's biggest banks using a two-tiered system to disperse that federal aid. I mean, the banks, they rolled out the red carpet for their wealthiest clients. You know, they got rid of all the red tape and the slow online portals for their biggest and wealthiest clients. And in the process, the bank scooped up over $10 billion in fees, because the bigger the transaction, the bigger the fee for the bank. And someone who in particular really exploited this Paycheck Protection Program was one Mr. Monty Bennett. Now, he was the single biggest recipient of all the PPP funds in the first round before they ran out in just 2 weeks. So Monty Bennett is a Dallas billionaire. He has 3 companies that raked in $2.2 billion in 2019, and somehow he still managed to secure $96.1 million in loans from the Paycheck Protection Program that were supposed to go to actual small businesses.
Katie, can I ask you something about Monty?
Yes,
Let me ask you
course.
about Monty Bennett. Does Monty Bennett have any political connections by any chance?
Yes, interestingly enough, in March, when the pandemic was starting to really heat up, his companies laid off 95% of their employees. They hired lobbyists for the first time. And Monty Bennett himself made just a little $50,000 donation personally to Trump's reelection committee. So he saw this coming, and he knew that he wanted to get first in line and take away $96.1 million in loans from small businesses who actually need it. And so it's no wonder that these initial funds dried up in just 2 weeks. I mean, you've got big banks favoring their wealthiest, biggest clients that don't even need the money. And then you've got selfish billionaires like Monty Bennett who are just eating up these funds that they don't need. I mean, this is really the most egregious example of socialism for the rich and harsh capitalism for the rest.
You know, it's also this payroll protection plan. It was a good idea, but as administered by the Treasury, by Steve Mnuchin, who used to work for Goldman Sachs, incidentally, it required the banks to be the conduits, even though the banks were taking no risks. Now, this is an important point, Katie, because the banks got $10 billion out of this first tranche of money, but they were not taking any risks because the money was being guaranteed. The payments were going to be guaranteed by the Treasury and the Small Business Administration. So all the banks did was just take the money out of one pocket and give it to another pocket, but took $10 billion along the way, and also made sure, as you said, that their biggest and wealthiest and best customers would be first in line. How do you design a program like that? I mean, I mean, how do you, anybody, particularly Steve Mnuchin and the Treasury Department, has to know that when you design a program like that, you're going to have those results.
Exactly. And another example of how a lot of those big businesses are owned by primarily white men. And there was a study that came out that showed that upwards of 90% of small businesses owned by women and people of color have been shut out of the PPP or are going to be shut out in the next round. So not only is it just this huge favoritism going towards the wealthiest, biggest companies who don't need it, it's also a massive transfer of potential wealth and income away from smaller businesses owned by women and people of color. And the thing is, the biggest proprietors of this system of socialism for the rich and harsh capitalism for the rest are Republicans. And we have seen throughout this pandemic where their priorities lie. I mean, think about this. So a bunch of Republican governors are starting to reopen their states against the advice of public health experts, since we're nowhere near where we need to be in terms of testing capacity and contact tracing. And I don't think they were supposed to say this part out loud. But earlier this week, Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds, she warned employees who refused to go back to work because, they didn't want to contract a deadly virus. She warned employees that if they refused to go back to work out of fear for their health and safety, they would no longer be eligible for unemployment benefits.
So and we're seeing a little bit of a pattern. There is a little bit of a pattern here. In other words, you've got the banks and the big customers getting all of this money. And by the way, the next tranche of money for the so-called Small Business Payroll Protection Act, that Congress just passed, it comes exactly with the same organization, the same craziness
Yeah.
that you're talking about. And there's been no
Yeah.
change in the administration of this program at all. And meanwhile, businesses are saying to employees, you've got to come back. States are saying, Iowa is saying, you've got to, if you don't come back, you're not even going to collect unemployment insurance. And so people are being put into a situation where they've got to actually either choose to go back to work or and risk themselves and risk their lives, risk their families, or starve. I mean, essentially, it comes back
Exactly.
down to that kind of a choice.
Yeah.
Where's the common
Yeah.
good, Katie? Where is
It
it?
doesn't,
What
it
happened to
really,
it?
I don't know if for Republicans it really exists because to them, their whole ideology is really about rugged individualism and pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. But I was really, really struck by Governor Reynolds' comments earlier this week because it really is. This is what this has been about from the beginning. Like, yeah, reopening the economy will be good for Trump's reelection. But really, what it is about is making sure that people don't have access to the safety net to get through this crisis. And to me, that's so insidious and cruel and just really, it was just, I know nothing should shock me these days, but it really did shock me that they, it's the cheaper alternative, right? Just force people to come back to work so they don't have access to the social safety net anymore. I mean, that's way cheaper than, I don't know, actually supporting our citizens and helping them get through this crisis. And in
Well,
addition, Mitch McConnell's biggest priority, yeah,
another example of that is
no,
the
continue.
meatpacking industry. Because you've got,
Yes,
Trump
exactly.
did not use the Defense Production Act to get equipment until the last minute. I mean, he refused to use the Defense
Yeah.
Production Act to order companies to do things that the country needed and healthcare professionals needed. But what is he using the Defense Production Act to do? Well, he's using the Defense Production Act to essentially order meat packers back to meatpacking plants that are unsafe, that already have a huge record, a disastrous record of causing people to catch coronavirus and causing deaths. They're hotspots right now,
Yes.
and yet you have to go back. I mean, this is really beyond cruelty. You used the word cruelty a moment ago,
Yeah.
and I think that it really is cruel. This socialism for the rich, harsh capitalism for everybody else, is tinged with a kind of class cruelty that I haven't seen in this country, I have to tell you, in my lifetime. I mean, we
Yeah.
certainly have had a class system. We've had the rich and the poor, but the rich have been getting richer and richer, and we now see a cruelty emerging. I mean, I wonder if this is going to have any political repercussions. Are people going to just sit back? I mean, I keep on saying to people, if you want to change this, get ready because we have an election coming up November 3rd. Get mobilized and organized because this is your opportunity to get rid of the GOP, to flip the Senate,
Yeah.
get Trump out of there. Make sure the Democrats are at least in control so that at least there's a chance that working people, lower middle class, poor people can be safe.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. To me, it's just pure, it's repugnant class warfare, right? All of the people advocating for the economy to reopen, they can stay safe at home, whereas the poor and the working class, largely of whom are people of color, they're going to go out and they're putting their lives at risk. I mean, in Georgia, one of the states that's already started to reopen, even though their number of cases keeps going up, over 80% of hospitalized patients in Georgia were African American. This is what it's about. It's about the push to reopen the economy is about it's about this cruelty that your life is fine to sacrifice, but as long as I can get my hair cut again, then it's fine, and you saw this is where Republicans' priorities lie. I mean, Mitch McConnell has said that his major sticking point for the next round of coronavirus legislation is liability protections for companies who reopen. So basically, he wants to make sure that companies can reopen, and when they force their workers to put their own lives at risk to come back to work because they need a paycheck, then if their workers get sick and are in an unsafe environment, they can't sue their employer, even though their employer knowingly put them at risk. And
In other
throughout
words,
all of this,
employers don't worry about it, because don't even try to make
exactly.
your places of work terribly safe. Don't spend a lot of money on it, because we're going to protect you from liability. And by the way, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is
Yeah,
supposed
the
to be
Department of
setting
Labor hasn't
regulations,
been anywhere. They've been
it's been
MIA
gone.
during this whole thing. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
When I was Secretary of Labor, we had a very tough OSHA. We had an OSHA that would not let employers get away with this. This OSHA under Trump basically is saying to employers, well, it would be a nice thing if you provided masks, and if you've got a hot spot with regard to your meat packing or anything else, that's for you to deal with. That's not a matter of the public interest, or the common
Yeah.
good. That combined with the lack of liability that are being pushed for, makes workers who are forced back into work even more vulnerable.
Exactly.
Again,
And
cruelty.
yeah, and it's like, oh, you really think corporations are just going to do the right thing on their own? Absolutely not. There are 40 years of history showing us that corporations will never do the right thing if they're asked. They never even do the right thing if they're told to and forced to. So I don't understand in what world are OSHA's, kind of milquetoast guidelines like, hey, maybe social distance, hey, maybe wear masks. Corporations don't care. They're not going to do that. All they care about is their bottom line and protecting their profits. But also, this is what Mitch McConnell is focused on when the Senate comes back on May 4th next week. He can't be bothered to save the postal service. He can't be bothered to get desperately needed federal relief to state governments. He can't be bothered about protecting workers. No, he's focused on confirming more of Trump's hyper-partisan right-wing extremist judges. So I just don't understand how you can look at that and think that someone like Mitch McConnell and the rest of the GOP has your best interest at heart. I mean, they don't. Their whole mission throughout this pandemic and their overall ideology, but especially in this pandemic, has been to make sure that corporations and the top 1% of earners get everything they've asked for and more, while working Americans are left with crumbs, left struggling to put food on the table, and the GOP is nowhere to be found, and they couldn't care less. It really is repugnant class
Katie,
warfare.
but they're doing that because that's where the money is coming from, right?
Exactly.
That's the GOP. I mean, both parties are drinking from the same trough. Both parties have a lot
Exactly.
of corporate
Yeah.
and Wall Street donors, but the Republican Party is overwhelmingly corporate and Wall Street. At least the Democratic Party has a lot of small
Yeah.
donors, and is not nearly as dependent on corporations, big corporations and Wall Street, as is the Republican Party. And so all of this is coming to a crescendo. I think the question for you is, do you think voters are going to recognize this before Election Day? Not just, I'm talking about swing voters. I'm talking about independents, people young people. I mean, you have a better insight into the world of the millennials and the Generation Zs than I do. Are they going to be voting, and are they excited by Joe Biden, and are they going to be as concerned as you obviously are about what's going on now, pandemic-wise, and
Yeah.
even before the pandemic?
I think for me, it all lies within the framing of how you do it. And in my opinion, Democrats really haven't gotten ahead of the narrative. I mean, if you lay it out like this, when the government passed a $2 trillion spending bill, all they could be bothered to give you and all of your friends and your family was just a measly $1,200 check one time. How are you going to put food on the table? How are you going to pay your mortgage, your rent, your car payments? How are you going to pay any of your bills with just that one $1,200 check? That's all Republicans wanted to give you. On the other hand, they made sure that Boeing got a slice of $500 billion of a blank check with no oversight. That's where their priorities lie. They care about United, they care about Boeing, they care about Amazon, and they do not care about you. So I really think to get people to understand this kind of disparity and understand the concept of socialism for the rich, harsh capitalism for the rest, it's all about controlling the narrative. It's all about getting ahead of that. And I really would like to see Democrats hammer that home and say, hey, look what Republicans have done. They want you to sacrifice your life for their stock portfolio gains. They do not care about you. We care about you. This is why you need to vote for us. And I really haven't seen Democrats make that case very clearly yet. So I hope that they get get it together and really push that narrative and make people understand. Because when you lay it out in simple terms like that, the choice is clear. It's really about getting that message out.
Well, and I think the message actually, people are more prepared to hear that message during the pandemic, and given what's happened to the economy and given what they can see around them and what's happened to their own families, than they might have been prepared to hear it before.
Yes.
Katie, we're going to have to come to an end pretty soon, unfortunately. There's so much more to talk about, but
I know we could rant about
hang in
billionaires
there,
and
hang
Mitch
in there,
McConnell
and
all
again,
day.
and again, start focusing like a laser on November 3rd. I mean, this is when it all comes to the final boil. I mean, we have
Yes.
you and I and everybody else watching, if you want, can be angry and can be infuriated and outraged by what's going on. But unless we actually change our system, we're going to have more of the same in the future. So that's why 6 months, almost exactly 6 months, election day, start organizing, mobilizing, getting involved.
Yep. Exactly.
Katie,
Well, I'll see you next week.
you have a great week. All right, be
You as
safe.
well. Stay safe as well. Thanks, Bob.